Now, Dr. Kirkwood.
So tonight we'll begin our lesson number 8 on answering atheism. And tonight we're going to be looking at several questions that I have looked at that most atheists have in their minds. Of course, it's not all inclusive. It's not all the questions they have. I've picked what I consider probably some of the more important ones, or at least the more popular questions that they have. And I don't propose that I have all the answers to those questions, and I don't propose that what I'm going to present tonight is even necessarily the best answers. But they are my answers, and we'll see what you think when I present them, and go from there. But before we do that, I wanted to just do a quick review, because I said when we began these lessons on atheism that the principles were really pretty easy. And I know we've had 7 lessons up to now. This is number 8. We've talked about a lot of things. And they really have, if you narrow it down, there are really just a few basic principles that we've talked about. And they're not difficult at all, as I said. And they really fall in basically 3 categories, and we'll discuss them. But the first one is that materialism is a bankrupt philosophy because it results in no free will and no right or wrong. The second one is what was called the cosmological argument. Dr. William Craig is real famous for espousing this view, and that is that the universe had a beginning and therefore had a cause. And it's pretty hard to dispute that now, because we know from science at least says that the universe had a beginning, and we sure know that the Bible said that universe has a beginning. So both science and the Bible agree with that point, and that is the universe had a beginning. What we disagree on is that I believe that when something has a beginning, it has to have a cause. Everything we know of that has a beginning has a cause, the universe included. Therefore, it was God, and what would that cause look like? We said that it would be a supreme being, all omnipotent, all omniscient, transcending time and space, therefore God. So that's the cosmological argument. We also have looked at the universe as being very finely tuned. That would be also referred to as the teleologic argument. And it certainly argues for design, and we spent a lot of time looking at that. And then the third one is the morality argument, and that is morality only exists because there is a God. Now, we don't claim, and I certainly don't claim, that atheists are immoral people. That's not the point here. My point is, where do they get the morality? That I don't claim that they say that they're immoral people. Like I say, a lot of atheists are very fine moral people. But yet if you ask them, well, where did you get your morality? How did you determine what your morality is? They'll start using words like right and wrong. Well, if materialism is all there is, then there really isn't any right or wrong, is there? So the morality speaks for a God. I've watched several videos, YouTube videos, where this question has been asked in seminars and places like that, and atheists are in the audience. And when the atheist comes to the podium and asks the questions, when it boils down to it, they just don't have an answer. Well, I think that morality exists for the greater good of humanity. The greater good? What's the greater good? You're going to have to tell me what the word good means. Where did you get the idea of good? Well, it's so that we could propagate the species. We need to be kind to each other. Well, why is that a good thing, to propagate the species? You're back to that idea again. What's good? And they can't define that. It's almost embarrassing to them, because when they get down to it, they can't. The only basis for morality is really God. But again, not saying that atheists are immoral people. And we looked at origin of life experiments, and this really goes back to a large extent the teleologic argument. And we see how impossible it would be for life to begin spontaneously. And we've seen very, I think, soundly that evolution cannot possibly explain how life began or how kinds have progressed into kinds. So those are really pretty simple arguments. They really are, and they're pretty simple answers. It's just, which one are you going to believe? And I think logic demands that we believe that there's a God. So I think we've established that, at least from my point of view. No, not everybody that has responded to our YouTube videos has said, okay, I agree with you. Now you've convinced me, let's go on. That hasn't happened. They come with already their minds made up. And that's unfortunate, because I think if they had an open mind, they would be open to some of these arguments. But they do have questions, and we're going to look at these questions tonight, hopefully get through them, so that we can move on to what begins the really important things, and that is looking at the Bible, evidence that the Bible is unique, and that the Bible is the only religious work that can prove in and of itself that it's from God, because I certainly believe it can and does. And then we're going to look at the crucifixion of Christ. That's going to be the ultimate proof that there's a God, isn't there? Because everything falls or rises on that fact. If Christ be not crucified, what did Paul say? We are all men to be most pitied, didn't he? And we're going to look at that. But I want to look at 4 arguments here tonight. The first one involves the concept of evil and suffering and the question of why. The second one is, did Christianity borrow from pagan religions? That became a very popular thing a few years ago with the publication of the Da Vinci Code, where Dan Brown borrowed from the Da Vinci Code several other works that talked about how Christianity simply borrowed a lot of pagan ideas. That the main character in the Da Vinci Code, Tibbing, says that everything in Christianity is not new, it's all borrowed. And we'll look at that. We're going to look at the time-light travel issue, and that's the idea of stars or galaxies being millions and billions of years away. How would a young Earth creationist explain that? And then finally, is there scientific evidence for a Big Bang? Because the Big Bang cosmologists, the Big Bang atheists produced evidence. They do have evidence for something, and so we're going to look at that because I think it's important. And I said, once again, this is not an all-inclusive list. There are a lot of questions that they ask, but probably the number one question that is asked, not necessarily only by atheists or agnostics, is this one right here. And so John MacArthur says that this is the most common question. He's sort of an apologist for Christianity along with dozens of other people, me included. And that is this question right here. And that is, if God is so benevolent, why is there suffering and evil? If God created everything, doesn't that mean he created evil? Now, what's the problem you see with that question to begin with if it's coming from an agnostic or materialist? You see a problem with the very question. Well, what's evil? That's the question. So they've already sort of agreed with you that there's evil if they ask that question. Because why else would they ask the question? But if God is so benevolent, why is there suffering and evil? And again, if God created everything, doesn't that mean he created evil? And then the last, these all kind of go together, so I've lumped them into each other. And that is, haven't millions of people died at the hands of Christians? Have you ever heard that argument before? Surely you have. And that is that, well, Christianity is just as bad as any other religion. Millions of people have died at the hands of Christians. And I just listed a few examples here. The Crusades being one of them, the Spanish Inquisition. We know about the Spanish Inquisition and also the Irish Troubles, as they're called, and we'll look at that. But when I started looking at it, they're very hard questions. These are not necessarily easy questions to answer. I think Jerry would agree with that. They're not easy questions. Jerry has preached sermons on this, so I don't want to go over everything he's preached. And again, this is not all inclusive, but my answer to this is going to be to just present some facts and then let you figure out how you would decide how to answer this question. And I apologize to Norris and my wife Cherry, because the next few things I'm going to talk about are not on the slides. So you might want to take notes, but they're not in your handouts either. Having said that, I certainly appreciate Norris for what he does. You don't realize that, but a lot of times he doesn't get these slides till like Tuesday. And so a lot of this work I did was even after I presented the slides. So these are not in your handouts, they're not on the slides, but I thought they were important enough to present at the beginning of this. And then we'll look at some other thoughts regarding this concept of suffering and so on. And there's a syllogism that goes something like this. We use syllogisms in our class. In fact, the cosmologic argument is a syllogism. If something has a beginning, it has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore it had a cause. That's a syllogism. Well, this is a syllogism. Evil exists. Who would not deny that? Or who would deny that? I mean, evil exists. And even our atheist friends, by asking this question, are in essence saying that evil exists. So evil exists, that's not the question. God exists. And in my mind, that's not the question. I think we've proven that. So what is the conclusion from that? Therefore, God willed evil to exist. Both natural and supernatural evil and moral evil. At least it would appear that way, that he willed it to exist. I would ask the question this way. If God wanted evil to cease, could he do that? Could he stop evil? Of course he could. But he hasn't, and he doesn't. And I don't think he will until Jesus comes again. Evil will continue, and suffering will continue. So there's a part of that question that's absolutely right. God wills that evil continues to exist, because if he didn't will it, seems like to me it would be logical that he would have stopped it. Now he gives a solution for that evil, and I understand that. We can understand as Christians, we were never promised, the Christians of the New Testament certainly, were never promised to have an easy road of it, were they? And we know they didn't. In fact, John 16:33, Christ says, in this world, or in the world, you will have tribulation. So God allowed tribulation to occur to Christians, and again, Jerry did a very good lesson on that several weeks ago. And that comes from God. That tribulation comes from God. The ultimate tribulation, and here's the other thing. We also know, however, that sometimes good comes from tribulation. It comes from evil that was done. What would you say was probably one of the biggest or most evil things that ever occurred in the history of earth? I would say it was the crucifixion of Christ, wouldn't you? Perfect person, sinless person. Well, where did that come from? You say, well, the Jews through the Romans did that, but the Bible says God allowed that to happen. There's several, but we're not going to have time to look at all these verses, but John 3:16 says, we know this verse, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And you know the rest of that verse. He gave his only begotten son to be crucified. He did it. He gave it. He purposed it to occur. Acts 4:27 actually says that. From the beginning of time, that was God's purpose. Now that was a pretty evil thing. Now God didn't commit the evil, but he allowed it to occur. And those are facts I don't think that you can really argue. I don't think you can argue this either when you're arguing with the atheists. You have to admit some of these things. And that is, God is sovereign. God is in charge. God created everything, and there's multiple verses we could go to that. Deuteronomy 32:39 is at least one of them. And you can look at that verse later on if you would like. So as a result of that, and we can see in the Old Testament examples especially, that God caused calamities and disasters to occur. He caused them. He was the cause of those calamities. And I mean calamities where many, many people died as a result of that. Now, in the Old Testament, it was usually for punishment, for something that that some evil had been done by either God's people or by the Gentiles. In fact, what would you say early on was one of the biggest evils that occurred, or not evils, but calamities that occurred that God caused? The flood. Did I hear the flood out there? Yeah, the flood. God caused that. Now, innocent children died in that flood, I would assume. I would assume not all the people that went in the ark were the only people that went in the ark and that were saved, but I would assume that everybody outside that ark ranged from different ages, wouldn't you? I would say there was probably babies and children that were there. And there's been estimates on how many people that was. I hadn't really thought of this before, but estimates range from probably as little as 10 million people were alive at that time to as many as 100 million. That's a lot of people, and that many people died. So we can't deny that. And we see other places too. In Psalm 105, verse 16, God caused famine to occur, and people died. So we know that God does what he pleases. Psalms 115, verse 3, Daniel 4:35, Psalm does what he pleases. But if you have your Bibles handy, just turn real quickly with me to Lamentations chapter 3. And I'm going to read a few verses. Again, since I didn't have time to put these on the slide, I will just read these. And for the people on our YouTube, I hope you will get your Bibles out and read them too. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 37. Who is he who speaks and it comes to pass when the Lord has not commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that woe and well-being proceed? So woe and well-being proceed on everyone, not just the evil. It proceeds on everyone. Again, God does not create evil. I'm not saying that. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. God does not create evil, but he certainly allows it to exist. So why is that? And that's a very, very tough question. Why is that? And I'm going to at least give you one possibility, and you may agree or not disagree. You may agree or disagree with me, but at least to some extent, God has ordained evil basically so he can demonstrate his glory. And I'm going to give you two passages Turn to Romans chapter 3. We're going to read in Romans chapter 3, verse 5. But our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God. What shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? And Paul says, I speak as a man. So God demonstrates, or our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God when God allows us to be saved from our sins and we're able to obey his gospel. How about Romans 9? Turn to Romans chapter 9. Beginning in verse 22 and verse 23. What if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy which he had prepared beforehand for glory? So at least, I believe that's at least one way, or one answer to the reason that God allows evil to continue to exist, and does so in the past. But the bottom line is some of these questions are very hard to answer, and I will defer to Job on that. Turn to the book of Job, one of my favorite books of the Old Testament, and go to chapter 42. And let's look at the first 4 verses of the book of Job. I think you know these verses, but I'm going to read them. I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. This is Job's answer to the Lord. You ask, who is it who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I do not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I do not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. So there are some things that are just difficult to understand, but at least that's one approach to evil. Now I'm going to look at a few other things that I think are important in trying to answer this question. And the rest of these we will have slides on. And so in Genesis 1, verse 26, God said, let us make man in our own image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish, over the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. To me, this verse, as growing up as a child in the church and so forth, what did that verse mean? Well, at first take, you would say, well, we look like God. I certainly don't believe that's what this verse is saying, that we look like God, and I can look in the mirror and I can see a being that looks like God. I believe, at least to some part of this, is that man has free will. And there goeth the problem. Man has free will. And I don't believe the materialist that says we don't have free will. And there's too much evidence in the Old Testament and the New Testament that shows that we have free will. We have the will to decide right from wrong. God gave that to us. He could have made us differently, couldn't he? He could have made us be I guess, like robots, where we had no free will at all. Could have done that, but he didn't do that. He made us as free will creatures. And so we have the ability to do right from wrong. And the third chapter in Genesis, we see where the fall of man occurs. And we see the sin of Adam and Eve, or Eve and Adam, if you'd rather put it that way. And so sin did occur. And when sin occurred, what happened? Well, we know what the consequence, man knew what the consequences were going to be. Adam and Eve knew the consequences of their sin. It says, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it you shall surely die. Did Adam and Eve die the day they ate that fruit? Did they die that day? No, they didn't die that day. But they died in the fact that they were now going to die a physical death, and more importantly, a spiritual death, because it separated them from God. So that's one issue you need to understand, that there is free will. Part of the reason there's evil in the world is because of that free will. I'm convinced of that. And that's not just true of Adam and Eve. Not just true of Adam and Eve. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. Do you think you would have behaved any different in the Garden of Eden if that was you instead of Adam, or if that was you instead of Eve? I've thought about that too as a kid. Well, I wouldn't have eaten that fruit, and therefore mankind wouldn't have died. No, I think we would have done it. I think we would have done it. In other words, and we all have sinned. And the only person that says, the person that says he hasn't sinned, that's a sin in of itself, because he's a liar. She or she's a liar. You have sinned, I have sinned, we all sin. And as a result of that, punishment has occurred. Now, we alluded to the wickedness of the flood. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of thoughts of his heart was on evil continually. What did we study I think it was the first lesson of this series of lessons, and that was, what does God think about iniquity? He hates iniquity. He hates sin. God hates sin. God hated the sins that were going on there, and as a result of that, the earth was destroyed. I don't think it's really a whole lot different now than it was then, though. There is wickedness all around us. The evil abounds in our society, and that's a shame, but it's there. There's another thing, too. Now, we've talked about how God has acted in the past to punish man for sin. But I think there's this assumption. Sometimes it's assumptions that Christians have as well. It's not an assumption that I have. Maybe I'm wrong. But that is that we assume that God directly interacts in all of men's affairs. I mean, directly interacts. Everything you do in life, God is directing you. And I've heard this analogy used before, like you find a parking spot that was hard to find. Well, God helped me get that parking spot. Or if I get the flu or something, that's something that God gave me. Or whatever sin or whatever calamity we may think, that is directly coming from God. I personally don't think that's the case. And I'm going to give a few examples of why I don't think that's the case. I don't think God directly necessarily interacts with our personal affairs. Now, we know these things occur. This is one type of evil. I would call this a natural evil, not a moral evil. One thing I want to say here, because I've had a fellow answer me on one of our YouTube videos in the past, is the assumption that he made that I had never said, and that is God's creation is perfect. I never said that. Never said it was perfect. The earth depends on your definition of perfect. God said everything was good, and maybe before the fall of man it was, but it's certainly not perfect now. It is an evil place. The earth itself is a hard place to live in, if you think about it. I mean, we see evidence here on the Gulf Coast almost on a yearly basis with floods and hurricanes and things like that. We see earthquakes, we see volcanoes, we see tornadoes, we see floods. We mentioned last week the tsunami. There's bad things happening on earth. I do not take that necessarily as God's judgment imminently on someone who has sinned. Now, is God's providence behind it all? Very well, probably is. But punishing someone directly, I do not believe that's happening today. And now in the Old Testament, we know there were times where it did happen. And not just these physical examples, but how about disease? You ever thought about that? I mean, we all get diseases. Fortunately, we got a really good immune system, and we usually overcome it because of our immune system. But there are diseases that we consider rather trivial that are actually fairly serious. We're in the flu season right now. Every year, we see dozens of cases of flu, and the majority of them do fine, and they get either early treatment or they just get symptomatic treatment if it's too late, and they still survive. But we've had patients in our practice that have died from the flu. Not from the consequences of the flu, but from the flu. We think, well, flu kills you because you get pneumonia. Well, it does. That's one way it happens. But you can also die from the flu. Very trivial bug, it seems like, and that's why we do everything we can to give flu shots. But I think some of you know this, but in 1919, there was the great pandemic, influenza epidemic, that occurred during World War I. Some have said it is the reason that World War I ended was because of that. There more soldiers died from the flu that year than died from being killed in battle, or in those years. More soldiers died. Estimates vary, but anywhere from 50 to as high as 100 million people died in that flu epidemic. Now, I'm just pointing this out to say that the earth is not, and I don't think every one of those that died were being punished for their sins, especially when you consider that children were involved. Funny thing about that epidemic, and I'm getting off on a tangent here, but the funny thing about that epidemic, it was the healthy people that died quickest. It was the 20 to 40-year-old people that died, and it was their immune response that caused them to die. They had such a good immune response that their immune response produced all this inflammation and macrophages and so forth that plugged up the vessels in the airways and so forth and caused immediate death. You could wake up in the morning with the flu in 1919 and be dead by that afternoon. It was bad news. Could it happen again? Yeah, it could. We've had some pretty bad flu bugs in the past. So I'm going to go to a passage here that you're probably familiar with to show, at least in my mind, that all calamities aren't done simply because sin was being done. Now, we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so I'm going to make a statement in a minute that good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people. Well, they're really good people. Well, we all sin, but you understand what I'm saying when I make that statement. But Jesus points to an occasion that occurred here in Luke chapter 13, verse 4. And Jesus says, of these 18 of whom the tower of Siloam fell, and we don't know about this incident except by Jesus Christ. I'm not sure in secular history we can find that, but everybody that he was talking about apparently knew about this, because he assumed they knew it. He says, are those 18 on whom the tower of Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse sinners than all the other men who dwelt in Jerusalem? It's sort of a rhetorical question, isn't it? No, they weren't. They weren't, and yet this happened. I think it was a natural calamity. And that's the thing I allude to. We know that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. And there's a verse for that too. Matthew 5, and this isn't the only verse. Matthew 5:45, for he makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the just and the unjust. So good things, to me, that's just another way of saying it. Good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people. But again, suffering is not necessarily punishment for sins. And so when someone asks you, well, you think God is directly punishment, I don't think so. And I use John chapter 9 to demonstrate that. Do you remember this story? I'm sure you do. The healing of the blind man. What was the question that was asked at the very beginning of that situation? Yeah, who sinned? What was the answer? The question was, who sinned? Him? Well, he was born blind, wasn't he? So the funny thing about that question is, if he sinned, he was sinned in utero. Because I think the passage says he was born blind. But what was the other one? Are his parents, right? Him or his parents? And Jesus said what? Neither. Neither sinned. Now, he had a purpose for this particular event, and that was to show Christ's glory, and he healed him of that. And then later on, what did they accuse Christ of doing? Healing him, was this God or was this from Satan? And what did the blind man say? He says, I'm not sure where he's from, but I know this much: I was blind and now I see. And this is another important point when talking about suffering. And this is a point that really goes over the head of the atheist. Atheists believe there's nothing that occurs after this life, right? You know, you're born, you live, you die, and you're done. That's it. There's no other life. We know that's not true. So when you look at suffering and you look at the tribulations that occur in our life, and especially Paul was talking about the tribulations that occurred to the Christians there, we know that they needed to understand, and we need to understand, that this is very temporal, it's very short-lived. Okay, any suffering that we go through, no matter how old we are when we die, it's very short-lived compared to eternity. And Paul says this in 2 Corinthians 4. Verse 16 and 17. See, therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And so that's another thing that the atheist does not comprehend, that this is not all there is. And whatever amount of suffering that we have, it's very short-lived. We know God allows temptation. For the sake of time, I'm not going to dwell a lot on this, but we know that Job was tempted. And was he tempted by God? Well, God allowed it. He was tempted by the devil, and yet he allowed it, and yet Job survived it. And not only that, he wound it up, or he had more at the end than he had at the beginning. God allows temptation, but God does not tempt. Now, there can be a fine line, you might think, between tempt and try. But tempt in the form of tempting for sin, I believe, James 1:13 clearly says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But he certainly allows us to have trials and tribulations. We've already looked at that verse. Temptation comes from at least two sources. James 1:14 says it comes from within, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed, and it also comes from Matthew 7:23 says the same thing. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. But temptation also comes from Satan. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you. because of your lack of self-control. And then one more thing along this first question, and no, we'll have to hurry through these others, but I apologize for that. We still got about 10 minutes, I think, so we're good there. Concerning the deaths of Christians, this is a fairly easy one to do, to answer. First of all, there weren't that many people killed by Christians compared to the other evils of the world. The Spanish Inquisition, maybe a few 100,000, maybe 800,000 at the most. That's a lot of people, but nothing compared to other things. And that's in dispute, actually, how many died, and how many of those died just from travel, not necessarily from killing. But Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but my kingdom is not here. So any fighting that's going on in the name of Jesus is contrary to the teachings of Jesus Christ. So that is a bogus argument. That's not true Christianity when those things happen. Did they happen? Yes. You look at Ireland, where the Christians and the Protestants and the Catholics have been battling for a long time. A lot of people have died in that. And when I looked it up last night, it was in the order of about 8,000, not millions. Guess what? I think that whatever has been done outside of Christianity causes those deaths that our critics would say pale by comparison. If you look at the mass murderers of the world, Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot, Stalin was responsible for, they say, like 20 million, maybe more lives. He killed that many people, murdered them. Hitler, you know about Hitler. Hitler was actually, of these top three, he was the least, but still he was pretty bad. You know, talking about 15 to 20 million. Mao Zedong was probably the worst. He was probably in the 30 to 50 million range, and Pol Pot in Cambodia was in the 2 or 3 million. So millions and millions of people have died by mass murderers. They were not Christians. So that's a bogus argument. This one's a pretty easy one too. Did Christianity borrow from pagan religions? And as I said, this comes straight from the Da Vinci Code, and what Dan Brown borrowed from was two works done by Timothy Freak, I think he's a freak, but I say maybe freaky, Peter Gandy, and the Jesus Mysteries and Jesus and the Lost Goddess. His stuff comes straight out of these books. Well, what do these books say? First of all, I should point out, everyone, even Bert Ehrman, you know who Bert Ehrman is? Jerry probably does, but he is no Christian apologist, I can tell you that right now. But even Bert Ehrman says that these works were shoddy scholarship and we had little documentation and were nothing more than to sell books. But Dan Brown doesn't say that in his book. Now, I've been accused of saying, well, Dan Brown, that was a book of fiction. Yeah, but Dan Brown in his first part of his book said his what he talks about religious-wise was based on truth. So the big one there in those books is Mithras worship by the Romans. And he has been likened to the Son of God, that's S-O-N, light of the world, born on December 25th, buried in a rock, and resurrected on the third day. And see, Christians borrowed all that from them. Well, what's wrong with that picture? December 25th? When was that decided on? It's not in my Bible. Is it in your Bible? No, of course not. That wasn't decided to way after the Gospels were written. And so that's not in what you look at. And then they look at in their book, they look at the Egyptian goddess here, Isis, and it shows her nursing a child there. This is likened to Mother Mary, nursing baby Jesus. And then Isis, Egyptian, and here again, born on December 25th. You can tell this was shoddy scholarship just from that document alone. Here's the real deal. First of all, there is absolutely no evidence that Christianity borrowed anything from anybody. None whatsoever. And the thing about Mithras worship, when did it begin? At the end of the 1st century AD. Does that predate or postdate Christianity? It postdates it. So that could not have borrowed from them. So the evidence is quite the opposite. The pagans borrowed from Christianity. I'm not saying there couldn't have been the beginnings of Mithras worship before them, but it didn't flourish until the 2nd or 3rd century AD. And probably didn't have its beginnings till the end of the 1st. And so those are really bogus arguments. But you know what? They sold a lot of books. They accomplished what they were trying to do. I tried to look up how many they actually sold, but it was very popular at the time. But now we know that was shoddy scholarship. And there again, they did not flourish till the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And December 25th does not come from Christianity. Okay, now, doesn't the fact that stars and galaxies are millions of light years away contradict the Bible account of creation? Now, I'm going to say something right now. I don't want you to take it the wrong way. But this question doesn't really go to whether there's a God or not. It really doesn't. There could be a God, and in the light years, the stars be billions of light years away. Would you at least agree with that? It doesn't go to that question, but it's a question they'll ask because they're trying to shoot down what you believe as what the Bible says, especially the book of Genesis. Well, are the stars in the galaxies really millions and billions of light years away? Is that a yes or no answer? Anybody want to be brave and answer that question? I don't think I'm going to get one. Well, the answer is they are. If they're billions of light years away, they're billions of light years away. It takes that long for the light to get to that galaxy to us. And that's what a billion light years is. I don't think we can dispute that. They are billions of light years away. I would not even try to dispute it because they are. It can be measured. Well, what's the answer? Especially if you're a, quote, young earth creationist. The old earth creationists, they have a real good answer, but we're not going to look at that. We're going to get away because I think most people in here would be considered young earth creationists. Now, keep in mind, I'm not talking about the earth here. I'm talking about the stars and the galaxies. I'm not talking about the earth. They're talking about the light years concept. So there's Danny Faulkner, who is a young earth creationist. He's also an astrophysicist. He says if the universe appears young, then it should not appear old. If it appears old, then we should not expect it to appear young. That makes sense to me. He says we can't have it both ways. That makes sense to me. If it appears young, then it should not appear old. And if it appears old, then we should not expect it to appear young. And so we can measure the light that comes from these galaxies. It's called spectroscopy. And when you measure that, you're not only measuring light, you're measuring qualities of light. Light is electromagnetism. That's what light is. We think about visual light, but light is a lot more than visual light. You can measure temperature. You can measure composition. You can measure motion. All of that from those galaxies are measured from this light spectroscopy. So there's two possible answers to help with this, and one is the mature universe. And what does the mature universe say? The mature universe says that light was built, or the universe was built as a mature universe. And so that would mean that everything was built in the first day, including the universe, and it was mature when it was built. So the light then that's coming from those galaxies was made in transit. Understand what I'm saying? That the very beams, not just the stars were built, but the actual light itself that's coming from those stars would be built in transit. So the universe was built and bang, the light coming from those galaxies was already there, and that's fine. It's not very scientific, but it's not necessarily wrong. And once again, I am talking about the stars and the galaxies here, not the Earth right now. Well, Ken Ham, who I think most of you know, does a lot of work as far as young Earth and young universe is concerned. And he went to Russell Humphreys, who wrote Starlight and Time. And Starlight, I think I mentioned Humphreys before. He's an astrophysicist originally out of LSU. He is a young Earth creationist. So he believes in the young Earth. He's not a believer in the gap theory or any of those other theories. But he came up with a scientific way of looking at this that I particularly like. And you don't have to like it. I kind of do like it. But it makes two assumptions, and that is relativity is true and the Earth is the center of the universe. Well, we looked at relativity before, so I won't spend a lot of time about that. But one of the basic things that comes out of relativity is that time is not absolute. Very difficult for us to get our hands on, but it's not. There's been studies that have shown this. Time is not absolute, and we can see that on Earth. The National Bureau of Standards clock in Boulder, Colorado reads 5 microseconds faster than the clock at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England. I would ask you, which one of those is accurate? Which one is correct? Did I get a hand on that one? David, come on. They're both right. They're both right. They're different, but they are both right. Why? Because of altitude. Because of altitude. Time is measured slower the closer to the Earth's core than at a higher altitude. There's this concept of time dilation. Also, time dilation is different depending on the speed of light. We looked at this too, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. That's the twin paradox. An identical twin traveling at near the speed of light coming home would find his twin had aged much more than he had. That's referred to as the twin paradox. It's really not a paradox. It's a truth. That's what would happen. So time is not absolute. So using those two concepts, and by the way, the Earth, no cosmologist other than Humphreys that I know of would say that the Earth was the center, at least an astrophysicist, cosmologist, and maybe Danny Faulkner would agree with this, would say that the Earth is the center of the universe, but it could be. It's arbitrary to say that the Big Bang occurred, so it's not any more arbitrary that says the Earth could be the center of the universe. And he proposed that the universe was once inside a white hole, and time would be viewed differently at the edge of a white hole. This is referred to as the event horizon. That's what it's called in a black hole as well. And essentially time would stand still. So this is Humphreys. If you were standing on the Earth as the event horizon arrived, distant objects in the universe could age billions of years in a single day of your time. That may not make a lot of sense, but that could happen, and that would be scientific, and it would be true. Real quickly then. And if you have any questions on this, you can ask me later, but I apologize for the time. Hasn't the Big Bang been proven? Well, of course, it hasn't been absolutely proven, but there's some evidence, and there are three. There's the expanding universe. Is the universe expanding? Look at that in a second. There's the abundance of light elements. That's hydrogen and helium. Are there abundance of light elements in the universe? And then there's the cosmic background radiation. I would say this to the universe expanding, so what? The Bible seems to indicate that. Psalms 104 verse 2 says, and this is talking about God, who cover yourself with light as with a garment, who stretch out the heavens like a curtain. There are literally 7 or 8 verses very similar to this in the Psalms and other places. That stretching out of the curtain could be looked upon as an expanding universe. And that doesn't prove anything to me. God created the universe. He could have created a universe that would have continued to expand. So what? How about the light elements? And here, this is from Danny Faulkner. The Big Bang predicts an abundance of light elements, but information concerning elemental abundances was input to the creating model. So it's sort of like circular reasoning. You put that into the creating model and you're going to get an abundance of light elements, and you find that, but it was input into the model, and it doesn't explain anything. Cosmic background radiation, quite frankly, is a little more difficult. Is it real? Yes. Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson discovered this. Now, this is an interesting story because they weren't looking for it. They were working at Bell Laboratories and these great big antennas, and they heard this static, and they thought, well, there's a lot of dirt and bird dung on our antennas. So they went and cleaned all that off, and then they kept hearing this background noise. They didn't know what it was. They went to another fellow named Dickey, and he says, I think that's cosmic background radiation, and it seems to be true. But here's ironically what Penzias says, the guy that discovered this. The best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I had nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. And so it was confirmed by Kobe. However, theorists, here again it goes again, the theorists have recalculated the Big Bang models to fit the data, and it's hardly a perfect fit. Cosmic background radiation does not necessarily prove the Big Bang. Here's what I think it proves, and this is my personal take, just so you know where I'm coming from. I believe the cosmic background radiation certainly proves a big something. And I think it proves the creation event. God created everything, including all the elements, all the energy in the beginning. And to me, it's not surprising at all that cosmic background radiation would not still be around. That's just my take on it. Now, the white hole cosmology in this, there's a lot of more things that we need to study as Christians, to especially Christian scientists need to look at that will help this. But I think these are 2 plausible explanations for the atheist questions. Thank you. Next week, we'll be looking at the Bible.